Friends, I would think that there are probably three overlapping ways in which one enacts, lives through what it is to be interfaith, between faiths. The most robust and possibly the most enacted is one of people working together in communities on substantial issues, especially in complex societies, whether it's in India or in Britain, with their very different challenges, where when it comes to issues of humanitarian crises or everyday racism, institutional problems, that people from different communities with different degrees of engagement with their ancestral faith work together to have a better voice. Now, the advantage of that, of course, is that it focuses on the common humanity of people in the face of different circumstances and difficult circumstances. But of course, strictly speaking, that isn't in fact an engagement across traditions, because in a sense the theological dimension of it is left outside it. The other type of engagement is to a degree theological, in the sense that some kind of expression of faith is critical in engagement with somebody else. And I think we've seen some of the examples today in what our speakers have said of that, where in a sense one needs to balance out belonging to a faith as a commitment to, as our previous speaker put it, the supremacy of one's faith, while simultaneously acknowledging that the other person thinks the same about you, which is where the patience comes in. We can be patient with others when we think we are right, but we need to tolerate them. It's much more difficult, of course, to know that they think they are right and are tolerating you. So a second degree of toleration, actually, which one might think of as patience, in being considered wrong, is somehow something we accept and see how the other person lives through what they believe in. And I think that that is perhaps the area of the greatest psychological challenge, but also of social potential we have in a country like Britain, where it is not only, of course, a question of people from different faiths, but of course people from none. But to a certain extent, that patient listening to what the other person believes and how they think through the lives they lead in terms of the principles they adhere to is vital, because that is where we come to grips with the otherness of people, where we accept that there is something intransigent in the difference between us, but nevertheless we are patient. And I would believe that that is perhaps the area which requires the greatest working on in terms of the lives of people today. And I say that because I want to contrast it with a third form, the one I'm accustomed to. Because this third form, which is, I suppose one might call it an academic or scholarly engagement across tradition, is because of the exigencies of modern life, possible only for a few people, that is to say those who actually make their living and are paid to be scholars. That, of course, is an impractical idea in the ordinary lives of people who have got full-time jobs, got other kinds of demands on their time. However, of course, the third one is the one I'm most accustomed to, because that indeed is my life as a professor of comparative religion and philosophy. Now, what I do realize, of course, in that position is that I'm extremely fortunate that I have the time and the resources, and I have been given the good fortune of a life in which exploring ideas from different traditions is something that I come to recognize as every day opening up further and further recognition of my ignorance. Because the more you study the texts, the more you study the traditions, the more you realize how much more there is. And of course that too is fraught with intellectual challenges. One of my very close colleagues at Lancaster University, Dr. Shuruk she's a Sharifa. She's descended from the family of Islam's Prophet Muhammad. And she's a deep scholar. And the two of us for some time have been comparing the way in which women scholars and women mystics and poets have expressed their commitment and dedication to God as they see it in their traditions. I from my background, and I will turn to it in a moment, and she from hers. And we have so many challenges around us. We might, through our own commitment to intellectual goodwill, read these texts together, come to terms with the way they've been trained, to acknowledge what are the differences, and see through to where we might speak to each other. But she finds on the one hand, of course, that there are her fellow believers, many are puzzled not only by the kind of focus of the people that she is looking at in relation to other interpretations they have, the kind of differences that we mentioned between traditions, but I too have people from other Hindu backgrounds who do not know very well the figure I'm talking about, an 8th century woman mystic called Andal, who's very significant in the tradition into which I was born. But then we also have, because we are looking at this in terms of feminist potential, about how women articulate their own voice theologically, we have secular contemporary women feminists who have absolutely no time for religion because they think of it as perhaps the greatest barrier to our ideas about gender equality and freedom. So on all sides we constantly negotiate, and the fact that we actually spend our time reading this material together is itself important, because we cannot foreclose on what we are going to achieve, what kind of understanding we're going to gain. So for me, I'm now getting, therefore, to the most important idea of what the theological understanding across engagement across faiths really is about, which is the journey, which is that open-ended exploration. I was very fortunate some years ago to I had the pleasure of being able to chair a meeting between the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Owen Williams, and some of our very eminent acharyas and teachers, religious leaders from India, including Swamiji himself. And one of the most extraordinary things we had was this session when all these people discussed, all these very learned and spiritually sort of engaged people talked about the mystery of God. What is it they were talking amongst themselves? So each of them was talking about how they see their God, how they articulate love and devotion. And it was quite striking that they were struck by the similarity in their attitudes, not of course in doctrinal content, because even amongst the different Hindu traditions there were many differences in how their view was articulated. And this is the thing that we were talking about, and Dr. Williams has written about it before, but independently people were talking around the table about this humility in the face of the divine mystery, which is that simultaneously they could be deeply committed to their own tradition, so that they were soaked in its beliefs, its practices, its emotion, its values. And of course they did not therefore do it as a kind of an intellectual exercise. That is what they were. They wouldn't do it if they thought this was provisional, this might or might not be right, we will check it out. No, they were of course people of faith. And yet, of course, they were confronting the simple fact that all of us know, that the world is full of people who aren't like us. Nobody is like us. So how is it that you reconcile those two facts? And the agreement that slowly came up was that the mystery of God escapes us. That if you are truly committed to your own faith, you're also committed to a God of that faith who opens up these possibilities. Why? We don't know. Might it be for us to learn more from others? Perhaps. Might it be for us to clarify to ourselves what we know? Perhaps. Was it for us to be transformed in some fundamental way through this encounter? Perhaps. But you could not foreclose on what that was, as if you could judge the mind of God. It was in the act of engagement that they found at that point a sense of community, a sense of understanding. And that experience has remained with me ever since. Now, I come from this same tradition as Swamiji. I'm what is known as a Shri Vaishnava. In my tradition, we encounter God, understand God, in this interaction, in this conception that God is, we take to have given us, of the divine couple, Sri and Vishnu, hence our name Shri Vaishnava. So we take Sri, the consort of Vishnu, to be the manifestation of God's grace. So we take God's power and splendor and God's grace and accessibility as two sides of the way in which the immeasurable, mysterious divine comes to us in very concrete ways. And I was born into this tradition. My family, my direct line of ancestors goes back to the very founders of this tradition, the way in somewhere through the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, they infused the classical understanding, the ancient understanding of the Vedas, to which most Hindus conform. They infused it with this particular theological vision. It is historically the sense in which to be a Protestant, to be a Lutheran, for example, is to be a Christian in the way in which the Christian doctrines were infused with a particular understanding by Luther. So simultaneously you're part of a much older tradition, but also specifically in its lived ideas and detail, something that emerged later in history. It's roughly comparable just in terms of that historical note. So that's the tradition from which I come. But perhaps because of my own intellectual inclinations, but mostly I think simply because of the wonderful way in which life escapes our ability to organize it, I've had a much more complicated relationship with what it means to belong or to relate to or understand the tradition. Because my English wife was born into the United Reformed Church. Her father's family were descended from Dutch Jews. And our children are choral scholars at Lancaster Priory. At the same time, a few years ago, my son had to excuse himself from coming for the services because we were going back to India for him to go through the sacred thread ceremony, which is the initiation into studenthood that members of my family go through. As my son says, because he's not, he's a deeply thoughtful boy, he says he's an unbeliever in at least 2 traditions. What of course that means is, another of his great gems is that belief is tertiary, he says. Because first of all, the primary thing is your emotional sense of belonging. The second is your cultural familiarity, what moves you, what you know, how you live your life. And then of course there are beliefs. Because once people start articulating their beliefs, a father can disagree with a son, a wife from a husband, a mother from a daughter. Because when it comes to the specificity of what we mean, we believe, we are interpretively opening ourselves up Now, this is not to say that it is not important what one believes, but it is that it is part of a wider and more complex life. Only recently I finished writing a book on two of the most significant commentaries, medieval commentaries, on perhaps the most influential text in modern Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita. So I was looking at the nature of the human and the nature of the divine in these two commentaries by Shankara and Ramanuja, which offer two different perspectives. But I was also doing it in a comparative way. So often Sunday evening, wife's taking the kids off to the church, to the priory, and I'm up to my eyeballs in St. Thomas of Aquinas. I want to ask, well, what does that mean to be Christian? Equally, last year with my parents, we were very fortunate to go visit some of our ancestral temples in Tamil Nadu, with which my family had been associated for a millennium. And of course, as we were going through it, and Judith was very much part of my family, receiving, we were doing the archana in her name, the worship, invoking her presence. What was it to be Hindu? We have to be very careful about this. It is very easy to think that those who have had a relatively straightforward location in a particular religious tradition have somehow a clarity that is lacking for those who have had a more complex passage through life. The number of times I meet people who say, I'm not really Christian, but I suppose I have a Christian culture. I say, well, why should you be apologetic about it? How are the choral traditions maintained in the Anglican Church? How's the fabric of the great medieval cathedrals held up? What goes into the sustenance of this life is much, much more complicated than standing up on a pulpit and claiming what you believe. So we should not think that there is one way in which one relates to one's faith. There are many different ways, and life will take us. The crucial point is, even not having a faith is a pursuit, a tenacious human capacity to make sense of life. All too often, people who have a simplistic idea, the kind of Richard Dawkins tendency, think that they have it all sorted. They have, in fact, a religious worldview which is irreligious, and that excludes humanity, for whom spiritual faith and mystery matters. But equally, those who talk between themselves within and across faith should also not exclude those who have different ways of searching for meaning. So I want to say, as an academic word, it all depends on what you mean by faith. Not an easy answer, but the one that gets my students the exam marks. We have to figure our way through. Now, one of the things, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is the kind of interfaith dialogue I do is to work through text. Now, I have not had the time today to do, in fact, what was suggested before. That I have worked with Anglican and Catholic scholars, reading each other's texts through the perspectives in which we were trained. I don't want to do that. What I want to do is to give you a very quick example of what it is to mean, what it is to be a Shri Vaishnava. And what I want to do is to open you into thinking, what are the things you might recognize? What kind of an expression of emotion might somebody coming from a different background in faith recognize? And what they'll have to concede is specific and particular about that tradition. As our previous speakers have spoken, I'm sure all of us have had the sense that there are some things that make absolute sense. It doesn't matter what tradition you come from, how you look at the world, what prompts particular sorts of responses make sense to you. But of course, the particularity, the way in which the views are expressed are very, very rooted in culture, rooted in language, rooted in text, rooted in practice. And the great challenge for the larger notion of interfaith commitment is how to mediate between what is different and what is similar when we talk to another human being. But actually that in a fundamental way is nothing strange. That's what happens in every marriage. That's what happens in every family. That's what happens in workplace. That mediation between what is similar and what is other. So now I'm going to end with a couple of passages from one of the critical, important thinkers from the 14th century of the Shri Vaishnava tradition called Vedanta Deshika or Venkatanatha. And I will read out some passages. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote in 3 different languages. This is, for those of you who care about such things, called, it's a Sanskrit text called, a poem actually, called the Varadaraja Panchasha. And I will read some passages and comment very briefly on it, just to alert you to what we might think, what I know in the Christian traditions at least, and certainly to the extent I have studied Islam, that, and in Buddhism, we might understand these kinds of emotions, but at the same time, we make no concession to the fact that these are expressed very particularly in different traditions. So he begins by, be patient, he says to God, be patient, indulge this poor poet, rash enough to sing your poems of praise, when even steady-minded monarchs among sages, unable to fathom your greatness, simply babble and fall mute. Knowing well my heap of sin and harvests of endless births, O dear Lord, fearful I cannot say a thing. O sweet Lord, whose tender love flows without pretext, your spontaneous tenderness alone makes me suddenly mad with words. What can I say to praise you, and how can I say it? O gracious God, my light is small, a firefly's meager sliver. But give me mind and a tongue for singing, and I will straightway delight you with words of praise. My power alone? What can it really accomplish? O Lord of Elephant Hill Temple, what use would you have with anything that I could achieve by myself? But if something must be done, let it be done by me. But even that, would it not be done by you? It is not wonder, O gracious Lord, that this poem gives you delight. I wrote it down, but its words came from you. Doesn't the sweet prattling of the pet parrot melt the heart of a master? Now here, on the one hand, this is saturated, and I've translated from the Sanskrit, it's saturated with specific emotion and lexical references. But on the other hand, this idea that people of faith have in the face of divine mystery, what could you say? But even if you said it, what could it be except what God let you say? That interaction that goes into every poem, every hymn, every song of praise, every prayer, I have encountered in every tradition that I have studied. This place in which you cannot speak and yet you speak, and you speak only of that which cannot be spoken. So sometimes interpretive understanding across traditions, despite the cultural specificity, can be understood. Yet there are other places, particularly in the theological description, our understanding in each tradition of what the divine means, that presents often the greatest problem of understanding. And there you need an act of sympathy. One of the things that perpetually confronts Hindus of any background, definitely Shri Vaishnavas, engaging with Christians, certainly with Muslims, is the idea that for this tradition, the divine is often found in very concrete ways, as you know from the smallest site of any Hindu temple. And in this tradition, there is no question that the divine becomes accessible through concrete forms. Where the divine is beyond form, the divine is beyond all access. It is sheer splendor and mystery. But the divine does take form, allow humans to understand its accessibility. So the relationship between the transcendence of God and the accessibility of God for most Hindu traditions, certainly for the Shri Vaishnavas, does consist in the specificity of image. So this is something that no Shri Vaishnava is going to give up. For us, the temple to which we go, the form which we contemplate, is absolutely central. we do not have any question about the sheer transcendence of all imaginative acts of humanity by the divine. There we can deal with other traditions. But we have this specificity. So in engaging, here is an example of which you might see that certain kinds of theological ideas about God can resonate in different theistic traditions. Because Buddhism is yet another matter, I won't touch on it today. But at the same time, we need to accept and ask, why is it, how is it that people have this range of ways of expressing how they feel? Those blessed ones, O gracious Lord, meditate with tranquil minds on your essential nature, rooted in peace, opposed to every defiling thing, eternal, supreme, all-pervading, infinitely subtle, of seamless bliss. So far so good when it comes to interfaith dealings. But now, O Lord of the temple on Elephant Hill, whose body of bliss contains and yet is more than all your created things, the wise say that your nature is in your manifestation. Thus the minds of your devotees ride the crazy swing of doubt. This form we worship, is it really you? Is it merely of you? Or do you escape it? When we meditate on your dazzling splendor, ever vigilant as it is in driving away the darkness of delusion, ever expanding in radiance, always supernal, O Lord of the temple on Elephant Hill, the thousand-rayed sun could only be praised as deepest darkness. Each day, O Lord, may I enjoy with 1,000 unblinking eyes your dazzling body of light, your matchless splendor more radiant than each successive form you let us see. And I particularly wanted to use those sets of verses to contrast the tension that comes up at unexpected places when we're having interfaith dialogue. In my experience, it's always easy when you take the most abstract evocations of the divine across all theistic traditions. The supernal, the splendor, the ultimate, the eternal. Boom, boom, boom. You can list a whole set of things and every tradition will say, yes, we've got words for that, we've got concepts for that, we've got ways of invoking. As soon as you start asking, well, how do you relate to it? What is it that our forms of worship take? How do we take the divine to become accessible? There, the dazzling diversity, the irreducible diversity of religious traditions comes up. And I would suggest that this kind of impenetrability from one tradition to another is the place at which we must pay the greatest attention to those who hold different beliefs. I will end then with something that, again, I think anybody of faith would understand, and I know enough scholars who have no faith, who are nevertheless sympathetic to the human condition, who would express this relationship between the human and the divine. Those who accept this prayerful hymn, which seeks to be sweet to the ear, composed by Venkatanatha out of devotion, they will pluck with their bare hands every last fruit from the wish-granting tree set on the summit of your temple. I will end with an invocation that for 700 years my family have always said when we talk about Vedanta Deshika. Kavitarkika Simmaya, Kalyana Gunashaline, Srimad Venkatanathaya, Vedanta Gurave Namaha. Thank you.